My name is Samuel Reed. I'm 38 years old, and I run a sawmill on the edge of Harlow Creek, Tennessee. Population just over 2,000, a number that's been just over 2,000 since roughly 1987, and I have my suspicions about the math. Harlow Creek has one stoplight, one diner, one hardware store, and approximately 400 opinions about each of them. We've also got a Methodist church and a Baptist church directly across the street from each other, which Mabel Hutchinson swears was an accident of zoning, and which everybody else swears was a long story involving two brothers and a woman, sometime around 1961, and nobody alive will confirm the details. I've lived here my whole life, and I still don't know the truth. I'm not sure anybody does. I think the town prefers it that way. Most mornings look the same. I'm up before the sun, drinking coffee that's been reheated so many times it's developed a personality of its own, and by 6:30 I'm standing in the mill listening to the blade warm up. That low hum, that sounds like the whole building clearing its throat before it says something it's said 10,000 times before. I spend my days around wood. That's the entire resume. I can tell you which way the grain runs with my eyes closed, just by running a thumb across the surface. I can tell you which boards will hold a porch for 40 years, and which ones look pretty on a Tuesday and split clean down middle by Friday. People bring me their lumber problems the way they bring a sick dog to the vet, a little embarrassed, hoping I'll tell them it's nothing. In the evenings, I go home to a house with 2 chairs at the kitchen table, and I'll get to that. My father, Earl Reed, ran the mill before me. He died 11 years ago. Stroke, 64 years old, strong as a fence post the day before and gone the day after, which is how it goes sometimes, whether anybody's ready or not. He left me the mill, the mortgage on the mill, and a town that still calls me Young Reed, like I'm still the kid sweeping sawdust off the floor after school. I never minded the name, for what it's worth. Half the grown men in Harlow Creek are still called by whatever their daddy called them. There's a 61-year-old volunteer fireman everybody still calls Bug, and nobody, including Bug, remembers why. What I minded, what I never said out loud to anybody, including myself for longer than I'd like to admit, was that by 6 o'clock most evenings, there wasn't a single soul left to call me anything at all. My kitchen table has 2 chairs. It's had 2 chairs since my mother passed when I was 9, and it kept having 2 chairs after Dad went too, because by then I'd stopped noticing. If you asked me, and nobody ever has, because nobody asks a 38-year-old bachelor why his kitchen table has 2 chairs, that would be rude. I'd tell you the second one balances out a low spot in the floor. That's not true. I checked, more than once. I got down on my knees with a 4-foot level, a grown man, alone in his kitchen, lying to a piece of furniture with scientific instruments. I like to tell you that's the dumbest thing I've ever done. I would be lying about that too, but we'll get to the rest of it. Before I tell you about the phone call that started all of this, if you're the kind of person who likes stories like mine, slow ones, about people who don't say much but mean every word they do say, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. Trust me, you're going to want to already be following along by the time we get to the part that matters. Alright, here's how it started. George Whitfield called me on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I almost didn't place the voice at first. Thinner than I remembered, a little short of breath, but still carrying that old pharmacist precision, the kind where every word gets weighed out before it's handed over. He said his gutters were pulling away from the roof. He said his knees had filed for early retirement without giving proper notice, and a ladder was, in his words, not a conversation we're going to have. He said he'd found my number in the drawer where he keeps the numbers he trusts. I didn't ask what that meant. I do now. I drove out that same afternoon. The gutters were bad, sagging on the north side, dragging the fascia board down with them. The kind of thing that's a $100 fix today and a $4,000 fix in 18 months if you let it sit. I had it sorted in under 2 hours. While I worked, I noticed things the way you do without meaning to. A row of prescription bottles lined up on the windowsill, organized by time of day, the way you organize anything you're scared of forgetting. A second coffee mug, already clean and drying on the rack, even though George lived alone. A kitchen chair pulled a few inches away from the table, like somebody had been sitting in it not long before and left in a hurry. I didn't say a word about any of it. I fixed the gutters, drank the coffee George poured me, and listened to him talk about Harlow Creek the way only a man who's watched it for 70 years can talk about it, which is to say with the specific, loving contempt of someone who has personally witnessed every mistake the town has ever made and forgiven most of them, though he kept a running list, just in case. I drove home slow that evening. I didn't know yet that the afternoon had changed anything. I just knew the coffee was better than mine, and for once I wasn't in a hurry to find out why. The mill's been in my family since 1958, when my granddad built the first shed out of lumber he basically acquired from a job that went under. That's the family legend, anyway, and nobody's ever produced paperwork that says otherwise. By the time it came to me, we supplied half the porches, barns, and rustic accent walls. Don't ask, within 30 miles. I kept it running. I kept the mortgage paid. I kept showing up 6 days a week, same as my father did, same as his father did. People in town know me the way you know the man who plows your driveway in winter. Reliable, useful, not somebody you think about between Tuesdays. So when George called again, 3 weeks later, this time about a fence post on the east side of his property that had been leaning like a drunk uncle since the Clinton administration, I wasn't surprised exactly. But I noticed I wasn't surprised, which is a different thing. I fixed the post. George had 2 mugs out before I'd even finished, like he'd started the coffee the second my truck turned onto his road. We sat on the porch steps, and he asked about timber prices, and then about my father, and then about whether I'd ever thought about getting a dog. All in the same even tone, like the 3 questions weighed exactly the same on his old pharmacist scale. I was almost in my truck when the front door opened again. A woman came out carrying a canvas tote bag stuffed with what looked like 100 manila folders and a set of keys, and an expression that suggested she'd budgeted exactly 4 minutes for this stop, and I was currently eating into minute 3. She stopped when she saw me. Dark hair, reading glasses pushed up on top of her head. The kind of look that said she was doing rapid math, stranger, truck, driveway, father, should I be concerned, and not liking any of the numbers she was getting. Gutters, I said. She looked up at the roof line, then back at me. They were pulling away. I said, fix them. Few weeks back. Thank you, she said. 2 words, measured out like medicine. Then she got in her car and left. I like to tell you I had something clever to say. I did not. I've been told by my cousin Wendell, after his 3rd beer at a wedding, which is the only setting in which Wendell tells the truth, that I have the conversational charm of fence post. I didn't argue. A fence post, at least, hold something up. Standing there in George's driveway, I wasn't sure what I was holding up, except maybe my own dignity, and not very well. Over the next 2 months, George found reasons. After the fence post, it was a rattling in the gutter. The gutter I'd already fixed, which turned out to be 1 loose screw, a 4-minute job that somehow required 45 minutes of coffee. After that, a porch board that might be soft. It was not soft. I checked it 3 separate times, mostly because I didn't want to leave. After that, the water heater, which, and I want to be clear about this, was not making a strange noise. It was making the noise water heaters make. George knew that. I knew that. We discussed it anyway, for the better part of an hour, with the gravity of 2 men diagnosing a serious mechanical failure. It was on the 3rd visit that Mabel Hutchinson introduced herself, which is generous phrasing, Because what actually happened is she appeared in George's kitchen, holding a casserole dish like a passport, looked me up and down for exactly long enough to be rude about it, and said, "You're the Reed boy." "Yes, ma'am. Your daddy was a good man." "Thank you, ma'am. You've got his shoulders. Not his hairline, though. Lucky for you." She set the casserole down, said something to George about his blood pressure medication that I'm fairly sure was supposed to be a private conversation, and left. Mabel lives 2 doors down and operates on an inexhaustible supply of casseroles and information, frequently delivered in the same visit, neither of which anyone has requested. If a tree falls in Harlow Creek, Mabel doesn't just hear it. She's already told 4 people what kind of tree it was, how it fell, and whose fault it probably was, before the sound finishes echoing. Clara. I'd learn her name by then, mostly because George said it constantly without ever formally introducing us. Was there sometimes, always on her way out as I was coming in, or on her way in as I was leaving. We existed in each other's orbit the way 2 people do when they're circling the same gravity, and neither one wants to be the one to admit it. One Saturday, I came in to find her balanced on a stepladder, reaching for a stack of serving dishes on the top shelf, the kind of shelf that, by her own description, a normal height person put up there as a personal attack on the rest of us. I held the ladder. She got the dishes down. "Thanks," she said. Then, looking at the ladder like it had betrayed her personally, "This whole house was built by someone who hated short people on principle. My granddad built half the cabinets in this town," I said. "He was 5'6". She looked at me. "That explains so much," she said, and went back to her dishes. I stood there a second longer than the ladder strictly required. She didn't need it again. I held it anyway. Another afternoon she left just as I arrived, gathering a stack of papers off the kitchen table, reading lists for the school library, organized with the kind of precision usually reserved for federal documents. She said hello. She didn't stay. After she'd gone, George said, not looking at me, "She does that." "Does what?" "Leaves before she has to." I didn't ask what he meant. I thought I already knew. I've been doing something similar for 11 years, just with chairs instead of doorways. It was a Tuesday in late November when I showed up and found Clara alone in the house. George had a follow-up appointment that morning. Routine, nothing serious. And in the scramble of getting him there on time, nobody had remembered to tell me not to come. So there I was, standing in George Whitfield's kitchen with a bag of deck screws. And there was Clara, sitting at the table with a mug of tea and a stack of ungraded reading logs, looking up at me with an expression that landed somewhere between surprise and the math problem from the driveway. Version 2. "He's not here," she said. I gathered. Neither of us moved for a second. Then she did the only sensible thing a person raised right does in that situation. She got up and started making coffee, because the kitchen required it, and because making coffee gives 2 awkward people somewhere to put their hands. I sat down. There wasn't anywhere else to be. We talked, carefully, at first, about the appointment, about the weather, about a leak under the sink that George had apparently been managing with a bath towel and sheer optimism for 3 weeks. And then, somewhere around the second cup, less carefully, she told me about a kid at the school, 3rd grade, she said, though she didn't use his name, who checked out the same book from the library 11 times in a row. Same book, every 2 weeks, like clockwork. She said most kids his age were reading about dragons or dinosaurs, or kids with magic powers. This kid kept reading a book about a dad who comes home. That's the whole plot. A dad who comes home, every time, on every page, like the book itself was a promise the kid needed to hear over and over until it stuck. She said she'd started keeping a second copy behind the desk, so it would never get checked out by anyone else first. I didn't say anything for a while. The coffee maker finished, and neither of us got up. "Sorry," she said finally, looking down at her mug. That's sorry. Too much. No, I said. Not enough. She looked up at me. Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, nothing you could point at and name, but the way light changes in a room when a cloud moves, even if you never actually saw the cloud. That's when George's car pulled into the driveway. Before I tell you what happened next, and I need you to stay with me here, because this is the part that changed everything. If this story is finding you at the right moment tonight, go on and hit that subscribe button. Every week I sit down and tell you another one of these. Stories about regular people, quiet moments, and the kind of love that doesn't make a big announcement about itself. You won't want to miss the next one. All right, back to that kitchen. December came in hard that year. First frost in the first week, the kind of cold that gets into your truck door handles and just stays there. And George's health, which had been holding steady yet managing for as long as I'd known him, started doing the slow, honest arithmetic that bodies do after 72 years of work. It wasn't a crisis. I want to be clear about that. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no ambulance, no late-night phone call, none of the things you'd expect from a story like this. It was smaller than that, and somehow worse, a series of appointments. A specialist here, a follow-up there, the kind of schedule that, if you wrote it all out on paper, would look like a part-time job nobody applied for. Clara took that job on without telling anyone she'd done it, because that's the kind of thing she does. I only found out about it from Mabel at the hardware store of all places. Mabel told me the way Mabel tells everything. Fast, casual. 3 other topics stacked on top of it, like she was handing me a sandwich, and the bad news was just one of the ingredients. And then George had to go back Thursday for the blood work, which Clara had to take off half a day for, on top of everything else she's already doing. Bless her. Did you hear they're out of the good caulk, the one in the blue tube? I bought the caulk. I don't remember what kind. I drove out to George's that evening. Didn't call first. I had 2 weeks worth of split firewood in the truck bed. Good seasoned oak, dried since spring, not the green stuff that hisses and smokes and barely earns the name. I stacked it under the porch overhang, neat as a brick wall, and I left before anyone in the house knew I'd been there. For the record, I didn't get around to splitting my own firewood that week. I told myself that was a coincidence. It was not. Clara found the stack the next morning. She told me later she stood on that porch in a row for a solid 2 minutes just looking at it, because she knew exactly who'd left it. The cuts were too clean. The stacking was too deliberate. Nobody else in Harlow Creek splits wood like that. Mabel's nephew tried it once, and by Clara's account it looked like a toddler had an argument with a tree and lost. She called me that afternoon. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Wood needed cutting anyway." A pause. "He didn't ask you to come." I know. Another pause. Longer this time. Long enough that I almost said something to fill it, which would have been a mistake, because what she said next, she said quiet, like she was setting something down she'd been carrying a while. "Thank you, Samuel." It was the first time she'd used my name. January gave George a good week. One of those stretches where his color came back, and he started giving unsolicited opinions about the weather again, which Mabel said was the surest sign of recovery known to modern medicine. I came by on a Saturday. Clara was there. The 3 of us ended up at the kitchen table after lunch. George is doing, somehow, though he produced the whole arrangement so smoothly you'd be rude to call it what it actually was, which was a setup 40 years in the making by a man who used to be a pharmacist and therefore understood dosage. Lunch itself was unremarkable, except that George spent most of it making comments that were, and I want to use the technical term here, about as subtle as a falling tree. He mentioned, out of nowhere, that the richer girl had married a fella from 2 counties over. If you can believe that, 2 counties like Harlow Creek men aren't good enough. He mentioned that Clara's apartment lease was coming up for renewal, I believe, sometime soon. Isn't that right, Clara? Which she answered with a look that could have stripped paint off a barn. He mentioned that my truck still ran fine. Far as he could tell, no rattles, built solid. By that point, even I could see what he was doing, and I've been told I have the perceptiveness of a fence post. After lunch, Clara washed dishes. I dry because that's just what you do, and because it gave my hands something to hold on to. George went and sat in the next room with a book he wasn't reading. I could tell he wasn't reading it because he didn't turn a page for almost 20 minutes, which, for George Whitfield, is practically a confession. Clara had her hands in the water. She didn't look up. He talks about you, she said. George, every time I come by, what you fixed, what you said, what you brought, a pause, water running. He doesn't talk about most people. I set the dish down. I didn't pick up another one. She turned off the water, dried her hands on the towel, slow, like she was giving herself a minute she needed. She still didn't look at me. And then she said it, quiet, like something she'd been carrying around in her coat pocket for weeks, and had finally decided to take out and set on the counter where somebody could see it. My father said you needed a wife. The kitchen went still. I mean that. The faucet had stopped dripping. The furnace wasn't running, and even the old clock on the wall seemed to take the moment off. She turned and looked at me then. Her eyes were steady. Her hands weren't. I think she was bracing for me to laugh it off, or make a joke, or say something easy that would shrink the whole thing back down to a size we could both pretend was safe. I didn't laugh. I looked at her the way I look at a board I'm trying to understand. Not the surface, not the first thing you see, but the grain underneath it. What it's made of. What it can hold. He was right, I said. That's it. 3 words. I've been saving up 11 years of things I hadn't said to anybody. And when it finally came out, it came out as 3 words, steady and quiet. And I meant every single one of them down to the bone. Her breath caught. I heard it. She looked down at the dish towel like it had suddenly become the most important object in the house. And when she looked back up, her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the kitchen light. In the next room, George turned a page. He hadn't turned one in 20 minutes. He turned one now, at exactly that moment, and I'd bet every board in my mill he wasn't reading a single word of it. He was just giving us the room. I could hear him smiling. I know that's a strange thing to say about a man in another room with a book, but I'm telling you, I could hear it. I didn't rush anything. I gave her the week, partly because that seemed like the right thing to do, and partly because, if I'm being straight with you, I needed a few days myself just to stop walking into things at the mill. I put my hand clean through a stack of pine boards on Tuesday because I was thinking about a dish towel. My foreman, Curtis, asked if I was feeling all right. I told him I was fine. He didn't believe me, but Curtis has worked for my family for 22 years and learned a long time ago not to ask twice. On Saturday, I drove back out. Not for a repair. Nobody had called about anything. I went because it was Saturday, and because for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I knew exactly where I wanted to be on a Saturday. And it wasn't my own kitchen with its 2 chairs and its level lying flat on the floor where I'd left it like evidence. Clara opened the door before I even knocked. I don't know if she'd been watching for my truck, or if it was just luck. I never asked. Some things you don't ask, because the answer's nice either way. We stood there a second. Neither of us said anything. It was one of those moments that goes on a beat too long and somehow comes out exactly the right length anyway. Like a board that looks too short until you set it in place and realize it was cut right the whole time. I brought the cedar, I said, for the raised bed. George mentioned it back in October. She looked at me, and I swear there was something close to a laugh behind her eyes, like she couldn't quite believe that after everything, what I'd opened with was lumber dimensions. But she stepped back and opened the door wider, and I came in, and from his chair George looked up, saw the two of us standing there in his front hallway, and said, like he was picking up a conversation he'd started months ago, and just paused for a commercial break. "Good. You're late." I was not late. I was, in fact, 11 minutes early. I did not point this out. Some battles aren't worth winning. By February, I had a standing Saturday. George never called to confirm it, and never once acted surprised when my truck pulled in. But I noticed he started having coffee ready by 10 sharp, every single week, rain or not. For a man who spent 40 years measuring things to the minute, that's not a coincidence. That's a man who'd been planning this for longer than anybody admitted out loud. I think about that drying rack sometimes, the one with 2 mugs on it. The very first day I ever stepped into that kitchen, before George had any real reason to believe I'd come back at all. He decided about me before I'd even finished the gutters. That's the kind of man George Whitfield is. He doesn't push. He doesn't manipulate. He just builds the shelf, sets 2 mugs on it, and waits, sometimes for months, for somebody to finally notice there's room for them. Mabel found out, naturally. Mabel finds out about everything. I think it's less that she gossips, and more that information simply moves toward her, the way water finds the low spot in a yard. By her own account, she told maybe 2 or 3 people tops. By Wednesday, Doris at the diner already knew. The woman who does Clara's mother's old hair appointments knew. The man at the feed store knew. And somebody, to this day nobody's confessed to it, had apparently told the mailman, who, in true Harlow Creek fashion, had told 4 more people on his route before lunch. By Harlow Creek math, that works out to roughly everyone knew before it happened. And at this point I've stopped being surprised by the math. The boy at the school, the one with the book about the dad who comes home, checked out something new in February. Clara told me about it on one of our Saturdays, very casually, like it wasn't a big deal, except she told me while looking at the garden instead of at me, which is how I knew it actually was. She said she put the old book back on the shelf and stood there a minute with her hand resting on the spine, just thinking about things that take a while, and then, all at once, don't anymore. In spring, I built the raised bed. Cedar, like I'd promised. Cut and join the way you build anything meant to last. Because that's the only way I know how to build something, and because it turns out that habit translates just fine from lumber to everything else. Clara planted tomatoes. George supervised from his porch chair with the easy authority of a man who has never once in his life held a trowel, but has opinions. Capital O, about soil depth, sun exposure, and the precise moral failings of any tomato variety that isn't a Cherokee purple. At one point, Clara caught my eye across the garden. She was trying not to smile. She failed. That second chair at my kitchen table is still there. Same chair, same spot, same uneven distance from the table it's always had. But it doesn't feel like something missing anymore. It feels like something waiting, which, when you think about it, is the whole difference between a house and a home, and I'd never have been able to tell you that a year ago, because I'd never needed to. I gave Curtis the level, by the way, told him I didn't need it anymore. He looked at me for a long second, didn't ask why, and put in his truck. 22 years with my family. He's earned the right not to ask. Most evenings, I'm still at the mill until the light goes gold through the doors. That low, slanting kind of light that makes even sawdust look like something worth keeping. I stack the day's cuts, same as I've done 10,000 times. And I think about my father sometimes, about George, and the way he never once told me what to do, just kept handing me things to fix until I figured the rest out myself, the way a good teacher does. About how good doesn't announce how strong it is. It just holds quiet under whatever weight you put on it for as long as it needs to. And I think about the second chair. Then I lock up the mill, and I get in my truck, and I drive toward town. I know exactly where I'm going. That's the story. And far as I'm concerned, That's the whole thing right there. Not a big speech, not some grand gesture. Just somebody showing up again and again until showing up became the whole relationship. If that landed for you the way it landed for me telling it, do me a favor and hit that like button. And if you've got a story of your own, somebody who showed up for you when they didn't have to, I'd love to hear in the comments below. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. I've got more of these. See you next time.